So, last weekend, you all may have saw that Mexico saw a wave of violent protests that mainstream corporate media framed as, some spontaneous Gen Z uprising. But there is growing evidence that raises serious questions about who was really driving that unrest. To break that all down, we are joined by one of our favorite recurring guests, Kurt Hackbarth, writer and journalist for Jacobin and host of Soberanía. Is it Oh God, I'm sorry. I'm like butchering.
Soberanía.
I'm butchering Spanish. Thank you. Which you should all check out. The Mexican Politics Podcast. Kurt, sorry I fumbled, but welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. And how do you do, fellow kids? Right? To quote the famous Steve Buscemi meme, which I think is the most apt way to talk about Saturday's AstroTurf March. And let me just point out before we start the look, Ryan, I have furniture now. Remember you interviewed me a few months ago?
Oh, congratulations. Yeah, you seem like you were being held hostage because you had no lights.
So there's a little bit of ambiance here.
Well, we're really thrilled that you've been liberated from the hostage situation that we found you in last time when you had just moved. Glad to hear there's furniture in the place. That's very exciting. And on that note, let's get to those AstroTurf protests. Kurt, can you tell us what happened on Saturday? Was this some genuine Gen Z uprising, or was there a bit more to it?
No, it wasn't. That's the short answer. A couple of months ago, nobody was talking about Gen Z in Mexico, right? It just wasn't a term that was part of the parlance here. But you saw, of course, the Jolly Roger flag in Indonesia and in Nepal. And very much like, the raised fist of the 2000s that traveled from, the color revolutions in the former Soviet republics to Venezuela, these things become basically off-the-shelf franchises that if you have enough money, you can just buy the franchise and try to import the color revolution to your country. So that's very much what happened with, the Jolly Roger flag here in one piece, right? What instigated this march was actually a sad event, a tragic event, which was the assassination of the mayor of the town of Uruapan in Michoacan, Carlos Manso. There is an important conversation to be had about security in Mexico, in the context of a U.S.-fueled drug war, right? Claudia Sheinbaum's government in 1 year has managed to bring homicides down 37%. But of course, throwing statistics at people who are in difficult situations, is not, the most sensitive way to handle a situation. So we know that there's an important conversation to be had about how to handle security in Mexico in the context of, drug demand from the United States and arms coming from the United States. That said, the march itself was, a totally an astroturfed event, right? You saw these supposed Gen Z social media accounts pumping out, clearly artificial intelligence made videos of instigating violence, with images of National Palace, what you're seeing on the screen up in flames, the cathedral up in flames, wanted dead or alive signs for Claudia Sheinbaum and for Lopez Obrador, right? So there was a clear attempt, and how ironic that this was supposedly a march against violence, instigating violence. There was an attempt to portray this as a spontaneous youth uprising, along the lines of, other countries we've seen with more or less degrees of, organicness to it. So we go to cover the march on Saturday, and we were looking around for the young people. There hardly were any. There really weren't. CNN managed to find a couple, right, to kind of bolster their narrative. But let's take it kind of in two parts. The first part of the march was very much along the lines of previous opposition marches that we've seen over the years under basically the slogan of the Maria Rosa, the pink tide, right? Very much middle to upper middle class, skewing towards the elderly. Remember, this was a march that was held on a Saturday. Working class people in Mexico work on Saturday. They work either half or whole days because they have a 48-hour work week, which is something the left is trying to change here. So just by the fact that the march was on a Saturday, you know that the march wasn't for them. And it was very clearly a middle and upper middle class crowd along the lines of the Maria Rosa. So we interviewed a bunch of them. You can check out the interviews on our Soberanía podcast actually organic social media. And they were very much along the lines of what we call in Mexico the tias panistas, which in English would be kind of your kind of loopy aunt, the ones kind of at the Thanksgiving dinner table when, just come out with this just kind of crazy stuff. And you're like, did she just say that? Kind of that kind of demographic, right? Of the tias panistas, right? Fustigating against, all the ills they see in Mexico. And it's funny that the slogans, kind of the whole issue of Carlos Manso got lost amongst, anti-Morena sloganing, really nasty, insulting stuff about Claudia Sheinbaum, her anatomy, her religion, her ethnicity, just really kind of nasty, nasty stuff. There were Nazi elements actually in the Zócalo itself. The far right was out, right? Um, so there was all of that in there. Um, so the whole ostensible issue of Carlos Manso got lost in there. Now, had there been a speaker in the Zocalo to maybe kind of channel the demands or kind of bring things together, because, okay, there's a march. People, you can't control who goes to a march.
Right.
Sometimes people say different things. If there had been a speaker there, maybe they could channel the demands and kind of unify voices to say we're demanding this. But there weren't any speakers. There weren't any speakers because the whole point of the march was not to, unify demands, but to create the kind of scenes you're seeing on the screen now. And that's when the second part of the march comes in, right? The first part of the march was the Tias Panistas in the back, right? Average age about 62, right? But when you got to the
Gen Zers,
the Gen Zers, the fellow kids with their skateboards, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, check out our interviews on Soberanía. You can see some of them, and kind of they go off. Like, Trump would be so much a better president for Mexico than Sheinbaum. I mean, just really just off the wall stuff, right? And they're saying because Lopez Obrador and Biden let in immigrants. It's like, what country are you talking from here? Anyway, go check it. But when you got to the Zocalo, things changed. Things changed. And we saw, running along the sidewalk to get ahead of everybody else were a bunch of basically kind of shock contingents, clearly paid with very special tools, right? With which they, got into the front and were sawing away to separate those barriers you see that were protecting National Palace. Now you see some voices saying, oh, well, Morena's scared. Why were they putting barriers in front of National Palace? They always put barriers up at every march. It wasn't just this march. They do it at every march, and they do it to protect, architectural monuments, right? And they also do it to protect people from themselves, right? Because sometimes people get out of hand. They start, trying to knock things down, burn things, and they wind up hurting themselves. So the barriers are always there at every march, every kind of march. So they separated the barriers, and then they started going after the police with some of that heavy tools, right? So the police, responded to the extent, that they could. And there you go. That's what they wanted. They wanted to produce those kinds of scenes for international consumption, for Alex Jones and all those accounts to say, look, Mexico is in an unstable position. Look what's happening. The youth are rising up. And of course, the United States always creates the problem for which they then sell the solution. And the solution is, let us intervene. Just say the word. And right on cue, you saw Donald Trump saying, I'm not happy with Mexico. And you saw the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City tweeting out, hello, we'll only help if you want it. Just say the word. It was all very well orchestrated.
Yeah, Kurt, I think it's amazing that independent journalists like yourself were out there on Saturday because it was so important to actually hear from people who were there and hear what they had to say. An independent journalist, Meme Yamel, was on the streets, and she did an interview which really shook me. She was speaking to a young man who was saying, all sorts of things, and he started to say that the sexual assault that Claudia Sheinbaum suffered, which was actually on video, and for which she has filed a, legal denunciation for, and she made an incredible speech about how this is for all of the women in Mexico, how we can't tolerate this, and there were protesters saying, that was a simulation, and we saw so many other kind of crazy claims there. And of course, with, the simulation thing, there's a lot of misogyny to unpack. Interestingly enough, no one seems to care about the anti-Semitism that's been waged against Claudia Sheinbaum. Somehow now anti-Semitism.
I've been waiting. Yeah. I've been waiting for the Jonathan Greenblatt's, the ADL. I'm sure he's going to speak on it any day now.
Yeah. I'm sure that's coming right up. Right?
It's coming up. It's
what they painted on the door of National Palace. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of the many things that it just, these desperate, insane claims. I mean, what do you make of this? That, in the reality, there's 70% approval rating of Claudia Sheinbaum, and these kind of insane, desperate claims that people are kind of repeating as if they're these parrots. So, what's really happening here? What are they trying to do? What is the attempt to kind of sow these lies about Morena and especially Claudia Sheinbaum?
Here's the story, and it's so important that you bring this up because a lot of the chants and sloganing I was hearing on Saturday were misogynist slogans against Claudia Sheinbaum. Very explicit, too. Very nasty stuff. Right? Here's what's behind that, at least in part. We've talked about on other interviews on this show that Mexico has passed recently a judicial reform, right, which provides for the free direct election of all of the federal judiciary, including a new Supreme Court. So the federal judiciary is no longer in the pocket of the Mexican oligarchy, as it's been for basically ever. Right? So now you have the owner of the second largest television station in Mexico, Ricardo Salinas Pliego, and his Grupo Elektra, and his Grupo Salinas, with a huge back tax bill of over $3 billion that the Supreme Court just finally threw out his last attempt to stop that, right? Just a few days ago, right? The new Supreme Court.
Coincidental.
And he's furious. He's furious about this. And so, it's a pretty direct line. You don't have to, see a lot of twists and turns in this. Ricardo Salinas Pliego, through his TV Azteca television channel, has been trying to whip this up in the most naked, bald class war fashion, right? We're going to try to whip up, right, a false astroturfed destabilization attempt, which, even if it doesn't work on the ground, will create the international footage that we need to try to push our agenda forward. And he's been very clear on that, right? One of his, his attack dogs were there on Saturday, of course, with bodyguards, right? So that's a really important part of the puzzle that the Western corporate media is not telling you. Right? That, you've got Ricardo Salinas Pliego there who is whipping this up. And this is not recent, right? You see far-right media like La Derecha Diario, which is run by a far-right Argentine, Javier Negre, right? Part of the Milei crowd. They were glorifying on Saturday the attempt to beat that policeman with this huge gash in his head. I mean, they were whipping that up, saying, "Look at the narco happening in this narco government, this narco state, this narco everything." So it's an international network. It's Mileism, it's La Derecha Diario, it's CPAC, it's the Atlas network, right? It's huge amounts of bot farms coming in from, Argentina, Spain, other countries, right? So once they select their target, it all comes in. And it's interesting, too, that it just came out yesterday that one of the supposed nonpartisan youth leaders by the name of Edson Andrade is in the pay of the conservative right-wing party here, the PAN, and not a little bit of money. He has a contract this year for $115,000 for social media work for the PAN party. Quite the nonpartisan youth, right there. So there you go. I mean, this is really very clearly an astroturfed, non-event. with conservative parties behind it, and with TV Azteca, with Ricardo Salinas Pliego, and with the egging on, if not the overt participation of United States elements. Let us not forget, just to conclude the point, who's the U.S. ambassador in Mexico right now? Ron Johnson. Ron Johnson is an ex-Green Beret and an ex-CIA. That's exactly what the Green Berets do. That's exactly what they do. Unconventional warfare, PSYOPs. That is exactly the mission of the Green Berets.
So good at it, too.
And and the Green Berets work very closely with the CIA. So it was a very natural jumping off point for Ron Johnson, after participating in the El Salvador Civil War in the 80s, to jump into the CIA and continue his murderous career. So he's been a very profile ambassador here, because the kind of stuff he does is stuff that happens behind closed doors.
It's really incredible, Kurt. I mean, I'm just thinking about the fact that I saw Alex Jones going wild for these protests. He was so excited, and all I could think to myself was, Alex Jones, the guy who literally thinks everything is the CIA, but the one time it's the CIA,
the one time he's right.
The one time it's the CIA, the CIA's,
thing.
Turning the frogs gay with bad water, but like, if you ask Alex Jones. But the protests in Mexico are actually legitimate. Anyways, Kurt, I want to thank you for joining us to break all this down. Super important, because based on the entire network you just described, this is clearly going to be an ongoing struggle, ongoing astroturf protests. I'm sure we're going to see more of it. So I'm sure we'll be talking to you again in the near future about it all. Kurt Hackbarth, writer and journalist for Jacobin Magazine and host of say the name of the podcast.
Soberanía.
And just very quickly, guys, there's a bit of good news here. There's a bit of good news. They were threatening to do a copycat protest today, and just a handful of people showed up. So,
Oh, there you go.
Love to see it.
You can only astroturf so much, yeah.
That's right. People just get tired, right? The old ladies have to go to brunch, and they don't want to get sunburned. So.
Got to go get some nutrients, ladies. All right, Kurt, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.